Today's episode is brought to you by RIMOL Greenhouses.
Whether it's tomatoes to market, flowers in the spring, or your family's harvest, growing in a greenhouse protected from the weather provides the right environment that you need for a harvest that you can count on. RIMOL Greenhouses are designed for durability and offer the quality that you need to grow productively year-round. Visit rimolgreenhouses.com to get a quote today.
If I may editorialize for a second, I own a RIMOL tunnel. I love it. We built it ourselves, and I really appreciated the quality of the tunnel as well as the customer service we received in the process, so make sure to check them out. Today's episode is also brought to you by Growers & Co. We are proud to be sponsored by Growers & Co. They specialize in making clothing and tools for growers like us, those who love to grow food, to be outside with our hands in the soil. Their functional wear keeps growers comfortable and resists the wears of everyday hard work. They also publish a magazine twice a year that celebrates growers who are changing the world through small-scale farming. You do what it takes to bring home that harvest, big or small, and Growers & Co. is here to support that important work. Visit growers.co or follow their amazing work on Instagram at Growers & Co. All right, let's jam. Hey, you all, Farmer Jesse here. Welcome to the No-Till Market Garden Podcast, Episode 4, Season 4. I have a super interesting conversation for you this week with Gerry Ross of Kupa'a Farms in tropical Maui, Hawaii. But the twist here is that the area where this farm exists is actually extremely dry, like 15 inches of rain a year dry. So we're going to get a glimpse into the dry side of tropical farming today. And we're also going to hear how they were able to take their organic matter from 2 to 5% very quickly. We discussed doing 740 straight weeks of CS8 production. We talk about root knot nematodes, managing the many intense insects they deal with, and a whole lot more. I really found this conversation to be fascinating and helpful. Also made me want to sell coffee at the farmer's market. Anyway, before we get going, if you would like to catch me out and about this winter of 2021, I will be at the Acres Eco Ag Conference in Cincinnati next month, being December, and I will be headed to England in January. More details to come on that. I'm also doing many good virtual conferences, including the Ecological Farmers of Ontario Conference in December, where I'm moderating 2 really amazing no-till conversations for 2 different scales. We'll throw some links in the show notes and keep you updated throughout the winter. Pick up a copy of my book, The Living Soil Handbook, from no-tillgrowers.com if you have not already. Happy to sign it as well for the holidays. Just email us and order soon from no-tillgrowers.com if you want it by Christmas. Also, hats are in for Patreon members as of today, as of the time that this podcast goes up. So go over to patreon.com/no-till-growers. That's right. We have the No-Till Growers hats back. You can pick those up at patreon.com first because Patreon members get dibs and discounts. But then after that, they will be open to the public on Friday. So check that out. Order it really quickly if you want it by Christmas. Seriously, shipping delays are real, y'all. So anyway, buying the hat, buying the book, those are great ways to support our work. And another great way to support our work is through that page, patreon.com/no-till-growers. There are discounts on merch and events, and at a certain level, or if you just bump up from one level to another, you get a shout out on the show. So big shout outs this week to MF, Philip Merca, Stephen Smith, Ojai Roots, Veggie Cropper, Scott Snodgrass, Jay Mill, Jacob Arthur, Fiona and Donnie of Firefly Farm, Jean-Martin Fortier, and Yannick LaPlante. Big thanks to everyone who supports our work. And enough from me. Let's get into this amazing interview with Gerry Ross of Kupa'a Farms. Gerry Ross, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to take time out from daily farm duties to actually reflect on where we've been, where we are, and where we're going. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming. I'm really excited to have this conversation and hear some of that reflection. So calibrate us a little bit first. Where is your farm located and what kind of acreage are you working on there and those sorts of things?
Okay, so our farm is located on Leeward, Maui in the state of Hawaii. And you would think of most of Hawaii as lush and tropical, but because we're leeward, we don't get a lot of rain and it gets pretty hot. So the windward sides of our island might get over 100 inches of rain, and in a good year, we might get 15. So we use a lot of irrigation, use a lot of drip irrigation. The total farm size is 16 acres. A lot of it is way too rocky to grow anything on, so we graze cattle in there just to manage invasives and keep the grass down. And then we have 4 acres that we cultivate for vegetable, tropical fruit, coffee, and cacao production.
Wow, that is so fascinating. I guess I just assumed that everywhere in Hawaii was 100 inches of rain a year.
No, we're into the U.S., the local hydrology expert for the state of Hawaii just marched us from severe drought into extreme drought, bordering on exceptional.
Wow.
So, when you look at an aerial picture of our farm, it is surrounded by dry scrubland that has been grazed bare either by the neighbor's cows, or when you get onto the wildlands below us, it's been grazed bare by invasive deer. So we're like this little emerald gem in the middle of nowhere. And we attract a lot of interest, as you could imagine, from deer, pigs, certain birds that have been introduced that want to come in and nibble on vegetables, things like that. So even at the end of the day, when you're tired and you want to go to bed, you got to go back and do deer patrol and cruise around the fences and make sure that there's no invaders.
Wow. Yeah. So wait, with this, I'm assuming the soil is pretty much the same there as it is on the rest of the island. That I tend to think of it as like volcanic. What's your soil situation there? Like, what soil types are you working on?
Yeah. So ours is called silty, stony clay loam. So it's actually got a lot of clay in it, like 55% by volume clay. And the Hawaiian Islands are really interesting from the perspective of a soil scientist and or a farmer, because the parent material for all our soils is the same. It's basalt that is being erupted today as we speak from Kilauea on the Big Island. And yet, as you go from the Big Island to Maui to Oahu to Kauai, the islands get older, but the composition of the original material is all the same. So soil scientists drool over this because they can look at how the soil textures, mineralogy, and chemistry change as a function of time, looking at the same starting material from beginning to end. So it's really intriguing for the soil scientists to look at that. So our soils they're pretty leached. They're missing most of their major cations, and there's a lot of clay in it, and that presents some interesting problems. Other parts of the island that have younger soils have different clays. They have different nutrition and different fertility. So it's pretty variable depending where you farm.
So maybe you can weave this into a little bit of your farm history, but you also have a PhD in, is it earth science? Yes. So how does that play into, are you one of the scientists that are kind of geeking out about the soil, or are you kind of also being able to utilize that for your production?
So geeking out about the soil, that's probably something that's unique to a geologist turned farmer. I'm not sure it has that much practical value per se, but as the earth scientist, I was kind of at the vanguard. This is like 25, 30 years ago, of what they called earth system science. So that was where you looked at geological processes in the context of all the components that contribute to it, whether or not it's biology, atmospheric science, chemistry, physical science, all these different things that kind of conspire to create the geologic record. So you needed to understand all these different components as a geologist. So when you come to a farm, it's the same thing. It's what Bill Mollison talked about years ago in his books on permaculture, is that, farms are this ecosystem, and the sooner you recognize the interactions and roles that all the different parts of the environment of your farm play, the sooner you get into this more holistic and healthier environment. So having that as a background has made a huge difference to understanding and implementing things on our farm. So I might not understand all the services that are provided in an ecosystem on our farm, but I know that things are happening, and I can see sometimes cause and effect. For example, right now we have historically low levels of both diamondback moth and a imported cabbage moth, which usually decimates stuff. And in part, that might be because over the years we've cultivated predators. At the office I'm sitting in right now, I can see a bunch of nests of paper wasps, of hornets. And if you sit around and watch and observe, which is what geologists do, they observe. Our eyes are fantastic tools, and that's what farmers should do too, is sometimes just watch what's going on. You see hornets hunting in the cabbage or hunting in the broccoli or hunting in the lettuce. And if you're lucky, you'll see them actually lift off like a helicopter with one of those little green worms that you don't want to see in any of your crops. So we cultivate nests for them by sometimes creating places for them to live, or in other cases, making the value judgment, well, they're not in a high traffic area, so we're not going to get popped by them. So do your business. So when we get really healthy populations of hornets, we have almost none of those little soft green caterpillars.
Right. I love that ecological perspective. So maybe give us a little bit of a history of where the farm came from. Where did that, how did you end up in Hawaii, and what sort of led to that?
Well, my partner, Janet, her parents started this farm around 1976. They retired early from Canada and bought the land at an auction that the state was having. So it was originally state-held land, and then came down here in the mid-70s and said, well, they can't play golf and go snorkeling all the time. So for some reason or other, my father-in-law, who's a surveyor, decided to clear land and start growing stuff. And the extension agent said, well, here's the stuff this is what you can grow. These are the chemicals you use. So he became a heavy-duty conventional farmer on the 4 acres doing asparagus, tomatoes, zucchini. He gave up on the tomatoes and zucchini after a while and then just did the asparagus and sweet corn. And we naively said, when they were visiting us one time in Canada in 1997, they were visiting, they saw an advertisement on our refrigerator door to purchase a working coffee farm in Kona. And they said, well, why would you want to do that? Like, when it's minus 40 degrees and there's ice fog in Calgary, Alberta, you might, have dreams about someplace warm. And so they came back the next morning at breakfast and they said, okay, we got the plan. You kids move down, you take care of us in our old age, and you can grow coffee on the farm. So we said, deal. And they thought there's no way they're going to do it, because I was an earth scientist working for the Canadian government. Janet had her own wholesale retail coffee roasting business with her sister. But we kind of put the 5-year plan into action and moved down here in 2003, knowing very little about farming. And, we'd had home gardens and stuff like that. But moving from a home garden to a commercial farm where all your income comes off the farm, that's a big step. So it took us a while to figure stuff out. We're still figuring things out because, as you know, farms are pretty dynamic systems. And as soon as you think you have something figured out, then some complications arise. So we just first started restoring the soil here. We got a soil analysis done, and there was like 1% to 2% organic matter. The pH was 5.5. The erosion rate determined by the Natural Resources Conservation Service was 6 tons of soil per acre per year could be removed during catastrophic rainstorm events, which is typical of the winter here. You get 3 inches of rain in 2 hours. So there's things in your heart that well, that's not right. So we set about learning what we could about how to keep our soil where it is, grow our soil, and kind of reverse some of the negative effects of conventional farming. So it took a couple of years. We had a little bit of support from the NRCS, and we were able to bring the soil organic matter up to about 5%. The pH leveled out at about 6.7, and the erosion rate, this is the thing we're most proud of in terms of soil restoration, is that we brought the erosion rate down to 600 pounds per acre per year. So that's a 95% decrease in the erosion rate. And I kind of looked at it at that point as we're a microcosm of conventional agriculture, say in the Midwest, where it's all about yield, nothing about soil health, and the erosion rate is not really part of the bottom line. And, we had basically moved on to a farm that had been run that way, and now we were trying to fix it. And we just thought of how many millions of acres there are in worldwide, but just think about the United States that take that model of heavy chemical conventional approaches, and the soil is not really part of the equation.
Can you give us illuminate for us a little bit that approach to fixing the soil? Like, what did you do that took it from that 2 to 5%? And
okay, so there's a number of different things we did. Is that first of all, we recognized that we're not going to get any income off of this farm for a couple of years. So that basically sucked up all of the savings that we brought over from the mainland. We were also able to get NRCS funding for, I think, years 2 through 5. So that paid for the cost of cover crops. We were one of the first farms at this elevation in Hawaii to institute cover crops. There was no information on what worked, what didn't. So we just ordered like 15 different varieties of cover crops from Peaceful Valley Farm Supply and got the equipment we needed for seeding them. And we just started growing cover crops in all these fields. We had 11 different fields. Just started doing cover crops in them, mowing them down, seeing which ones did the best in terms of weed competition, biomass production, stuff like that. And, figured out some that worked really well for us, some that didn't. We were also able to get pretty good quality compost, which is not the case now. This was on like the last day that a company was open. I said, well, I'll take everything. And so I got like 80 yards of compost, which we hand spread across the entire farm. We also did mineral balancing using Kinsey Labs and their analyses and recommendations. And the last thing we did with NRCS is that the central part of our farm has a low spot in it that runs from top to bottom. So it tends to funnel big rainstorm events in. And so we were able to get starts of a type of grass called vetiver grass, and we planted those 4 hedges across this drainage area. And once they come together and the plants merge, they basically stop any erosion. So that was kind of the initial part of it. And then we basically adopted the idea that bare soil fallow is a no-no, and we just kept our soil covered to the degree that we could. And I think that's all contributed to the decreased, basically non-existent erosion rate that you see on our farm.
Yeah, that's great. I'm curious. I know you mentioned before we started talking that you do a lot with wood chips, and maybe we can jump into that because I kind of want to hear your sort of wood chip, how you use wood chips and your sort of strategy with that.
Okay, well, that's a really good question. It turns out, like if you take our 4 acres, I've divvied it up into the functional components as a percentage of the footprint. And so, we do 40% in vegetables, 30% in tropical fruit, et cetera. I think around, I'll say maybe 20% is what we call mulch banks, which are functional windbreaks and places where we grow mulch. And then the rest is like access roads, and like 2% is the footprint of our compost area. So we plan that 20% of our farm is either windbreaks. We use clumping bamboo. We use overstory trees that are leguminous, like monkey pod and ear pod and ice cream bean tree, koa trees, which are a native. And then we have a whole bunch of trees that we planted just for the production of wood chips. So these trees grow anywhere from 15 to 20 feet a year. And we just go through on a regular basis, cut them off at sort of chest height, although maybe not quite that harsh all the time. But it's a thoughtful process of editing the tree canopy. And we can generate 60 yards of wood chips each year on our farm. So that's material that's born and raised on our farm. We don't have to bring it in from off the farms, so it decreases the potential for invasive weeds, et cetera. And it's what we use for mulch in between rows and beds. It's what we use for mulch around trees. And it's also what we use for the carbon source for our compost operation.
In those trees, are those willows or what's the species there?
Oh, right. Okay. So one of them is called the Gliricidia cipum. It's a native to Latin America. It's also called Madre de Cacao. So it's used as a canopy for young cacao trees. Another one is called Caliandra. We also have a type of Lucena, which was bred by the University of Hawaii to be seedless, because some Lucena is very seedy and therefore very weedy. And to a lesser extent, we use pigeon pea as part of that mix. But it's 4 different leguminous trees, so they're fixing nitrogen in the soil. They have seasonal leaf drops, so that's another way of getting nitrogen into and organic matter into your soil just by having these trees live there. And all of those trees are actually desirable food for pollinators. So they're multifunction.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, so you're going through and you're sort of, like you said, editing the canopy, and you're collecting all that in the back of a truck or something, right? And then you're taking it and chipping it. What's your wood chipper setup, and like how does that work? Like, is it just one day you just knock it all out, or is it over the course of several days, or how does that all go?
It's a progressive type of thing. You know, I don't know any farmer that is all caught up on all the stuff they have to do. So that's one of the things on our to-do list. And so we have patches where we're caught up, and we have places where, boy, that looks furry. We got to get in there. So we have a really nice chipper made by Woodmax that fits onto the back of our 46 horsepower John Deere. And so we'll just cut everything and then kind of stack it so it's ready to go, and then roll the John Deere in there, and then we just fire everything in. It's a hydraulic feed, so it's really safe, and it just produces fabulous wood chips. And, you know, we can crank with those things. So instead of making a full day of it, we do it in bits and pieces. And that way, one of the mantras that we have is grow the mulch close to where you need it. So we have piles of mulch all over the farm. And it could be some of the vetiver grass hedges that we can cut with a hedge trimmer. And then that ends up being mulch you can use in the vegetable production, or the wood chips that we produce from the fast-growing trees. And we have piles of those, and we can either use those in the veg production areas, we can use those in the compost. But we try not to move stuff around too much, because that's extra energy that we'd rather not expend.
And then are you all doing composting and those sorts of things, like making your own compost with the wood chips, or what is that an operation that you have going?
Yes, that is. So unfortunately, and contrary to what you might think or what your preconceived notion might be, Maui does not have a source of high quality, affordable compost. And even material, there is no high quality compost here unless you make it yourself. So the few people that do make compost and sell it, it's not particularly high quality. And part of that is because the state regulations on compost facilities for commercial production do not allow food waste or animal carcasses or anything like that. So it's this real detach in terms of nitrogen sources going into compost. We are too small to be regulated, and we're not commercial. So I think when we were full on with all the food waste from restaurants that we sell to, we were doing about 50 tons of food waste a year that would cycle through our compost operation. We make these static aerated piles with drainage pipes and aeration pipes at the bottom. And with COVID and the downturn of that, a lot of the restaurants are not producing what they did. Some of them aren't even in business anymore. So we've turned to a lot more fish waste, both from fishermen, carcasses from hunters, and we have this indescribable problem of invasive deer on the island. So we are not above collecting fresh roadkill or having hunters bring carcasses to us. So we use a lot of animals in the compost, and we make some dynamite compost. It's really good. That's the powerhouse of our farm, I would say. We're introducing organic matter and biology into our farm as much as we can. It's a pretty serious commitment of time, but I think it's totally worth it.
Yeah, and I do want to talk a little bit about the CSA that you ran and some of your marketing and that sort of stuff in a minute, but I'm not ready to get off the compost because you mentioned the static aerated piles. Can you describe a little bit more of that process?
Okay, so because we grow bananas, we can get and you cut down a rack of bananas, you take down the actual tree, quote unquote, it's that the banana rack was on. And we use that to outline a 4-foot by 8-foot footprint. in between, in the 4-foot by 8-foot area, we put these 10-foot long drainage pipes that you would use for drainage in your backyard or something like that. They're reusable plastic with holes in them for drainage out or air in. And then we'll fill to the top of those drainage pipes with coarse wood chips and or coconuts, just so there's kind of this nice airy base to the whole thing. And then we just start building up with layers of carbon-rich material, nitrogen-rich, carbon-rich, nitrogen-rich. And we'll spike it with crushed rock powder from the quarries. So that's basalt rock powder. And that allows the microbes in these compost piles to take whatever nutrients they need for their life out of these rock particles. And then that bridges the gap between the inorganic and the organic. So our compost, in addition to having, reasonable, expectable numbers for nitrogen, phosphorus, things like that, they also have a good calcium spike, magnesium, things like that, micronutrients that plants need. And we'll build them up to about 4 feet tall. We cover them with a tarp. We use silage tarps, things like that, just so that they don't dry out. So all we basically have to do is manage the water content in them as we're building them. And then we have a big rheotemp thermometer and we watch the temperature. If it gets too hot, we have to turn it. But most of the piles will kind of flatten out at about 140 and they'll stay there for weeks, maybe months. And we'll poke our noses into them to make sure they've got enough water. If they've got enough water, we just cover them back up. If they're too dry, we add more water, maybe stir them up a bit with a pitchfork. If they're too wet, we have some covers that breathe a little bit better. So it's management. It takes us probably 6 hours of farm time a week to do that because we pick up food waste twice a week, and then you just never know what's going to happen with roadkill and hunters and stuff like that. You always have to be on the ready to accept stuff.
And then are you all certified organic?
We were certified organic for 2 years, kind of from like 2013 to 2015, somewhere in that neighborhood. But we ended up kind of butting heads with the certification guys. And one of them was over compost. Because when you apply for certification, you're given all these modules to fill out. And some of them are pretty innocuous, like, where is your farm and the maps and all that kind of stuff. And some of them are like, do you use compost? And it's like, well, of course we use compost. We're an organic farm, right? And I asked the certifier, I said, is this an option? Do you guys certify farms that don't use compost? He said, well, some farms don't use compost. And I go, but that's like a non-starter if you're an organic farmer. It just doesn't seem right. So in order for us to keep our certification, we had to have daily temperature records for each compost pile. And we have 8 of them on the go, one that we're building today and one that we're harvesting today. And then the other 6 are in various stages of decomposition. Plus, we had to keep track of everything that went in there. And I was like, this is a pain in the neck. And there's people that get certified that don't do this. So that was a problem that we had. And the other problem that I think you can appreciate is that for every farm and every microclimate, you will find plant varieties, cultivars that work really well on your farm. Maybe it's a lettuce variety that can handle the summer heat, or maybe, whatever. And so we have lots of different varieties of plants that we grow here. And the certifiers say, well, you have to have only certified organic seeds, or you have to demonstrate through a paper trail that you went to 3 websites or seed suppliers and couldn't find pumba onions in a organic way, or that were raised organically. And I looked at them, I said, are you kidding? We do like 60 different varieties of lettuce. Well, you're going to have to go through that. And I was like, this is crazy. And then there was a really good article in Acres USA where I forget the name of the fellow. He wrote an article about how this requirement for certified organic farms to use strictly organic seed is noble, and we should be there someday. But right now, the funding and availability of high quality, organically raised and bred seeds is simply not there. And they talked about, a farmer in North Carolina whose certifier said, you can't use those tomato seeds because they're not organic. You have to use these. And he's like, but these don't have the disease resistance I need. And the certifier said, well, you either use the seeds that were, that you don't have the disease resistance or you lose your certification. In the end, he used the ones that were not certified or that were certified, and he lost like $20,000 of tomatoes because they just didn't have the disease resistance, even though all the things that he does on his farm were organic. So at that point, we just said, we have sort of some philosophical differences here, and it hasn't made a difference in our sales because all of our customers know us and they know what we do on the farm and we're transparent about it. So it didn't increase sales as we thought it might.
Yeah, it's funny. We are certified, and I complain to my certifier all the time that it's just not really set up for intensive vegetable production and doing such a diversity of crops. It's the organic certification is really set up for monocultures. If you're planting one variety of corn and you're harvesting that and planting that on one date, it's really easy to keep up with those numbers, but it's really tough to not only keep up with it, but meet all those demands sometimes. So I get it. I totally get it. But you mentioned marketing there, and that's one of the reasons that we stick with it, is that it does help with our marketing. And I'm curious where the produce goes. Like, what is your sort of marketing? How have you done it, and how are you doing it now?
Well, we started out with a very modest CSA with 8 stalwart people who believed that we could grow vegetables. And so they were our initial CSA customers. And that was also how we were figuring out what vegetables we could actually grow in our climate here. So we did everything what was done on 27 Jevons-style raised beds. And then we figured out the rest of being able to use our larger acreage for other crops, figured that out. And then we started selling at a farmer's market. And a couple of restaurants approached us about growing for them. The farmer's markets, probably about 6 years ago, we finally decided we'd had it with them. And so we left those. So it was strictly markets or restaurants and CSAs. And then when the restaurants closed in COVID, we switched everything to 60 CSA shares, like basically in 48 hours, just using social media. And so we stuck with the CSAs for a long time during the COVID shutdown. And then as the restaurants started to come back, we continued to sell to the restaurants and the CSAs. And then we finally decided just in September that because, we're mid to late 60s, right? So we said, what? In the context of sustainability, I'm not sure we can continue to do what we've been doing. We've done CSA shares for anywhere from 8 to 60 families every week for 740 straight weeks. So that's 14 years and 3 months.
Wow.
So that was a lot of shares. That was a lot of work. It required a lot of diversity on the farm. We loved every second of it, but we did see kind of the writing on the wall that we can't continue this when we're 70. So we basically shut down the CSA on October 1st, which was a bittersweet adios because we loved our customers loved us. It was fantastic, but we just had to say, enough is enough. We just can't continue this. We'll work ourselves into the ground. Because over the time that we were doing the CSA, my wife and I had 2 holidays where we left the farm together. So that's in like 14 years, we actually had a holiday together twice.
Wow.
And you see that even on some of the Instagram farms, people on the mainland talking about burnout. So, when you're doing it, that's one of the aspects of tropical agriculture is that you can do this all year long, every year. And you go, well, how do you work in a break? Even if you do take a break and you come back and you want to start over again, now you've got all these weeds that have popped up and it's really hard to take a break. So anyway, we cut out the CSA and now we sell to a couple of restaurants. And we also sell through the food hub. The Hawaii Farmers Union United started a Maui food hub about 3 months ago, and it's working really well. Allows us to sell products online, and that's worked out pretty well for us. We had done some retail sales, but the retail people on the island, some of the wholesalers, definitely the hippie food stores, that sell organic produce and stuff like that, they worked us so bad for prices. We just said, you know what, forget you guys. And so they were the ones that had actually said, as soon as you guys get certified, we'll buy more from you. And so we got certified, and I walked in with the certification and 50 pounds of pink grapefruit. And I said, hey, let us know. And they were like, oh, we've been getting our grapefruit from California. I said, yeah, but we grew this here. And it made no difference. So that was one of the things that was kind of negative about working with the retailers.
Oh, yeah, that's a bummer. Hey, you all, just butting in here real quick to get a word from some of our amazing sponsors. Today's episode is brought to you by Growing for Market magazine. For 31 years, Growing for Market magazine has been the source of practical ideas and information for direct market vegetable and flower growers. All articles are written by farmers who get their hands dirty and know what they're doing. If you do farmers markets, CSA, farm stand, pick your own, florist sales, or wholesaling, whether you're a commercial grower or want to grow like one, subscribe to Growing for Market for the nitty-gritty details of growing, marketing, and the business of small farming. Available as paper magazine and a digital download with thousands of archived articles available. Use the coupon code WORM, that's WORM, to get 25% off any subscription at growingformarket.com. Today's episode is also brought to you by Tilth Soil. Tilth Soil, this Cleveland, Ohio-based company, is producing some of the highest quality soil mixes out there. That's why I included their work in my book and use their products on my farm. This is true. Tilth Soil makes composts and potting mixes approved for use in certified organic operations like my own. Their living compost is made from food waste they haul and compost themselves, and it is the cornerstone of all of their blends. Tilth Soils take regenerative and organic growing to a new level. For more information on their products, including bulk ordering and their nationwide shipping, visit www.tilthsoil.com. All right, back to the show. Before we get off the topic of marketing, so you're also doing the coffee. Is that, I think I saw on your site that you also do like tours and stuff. So like, is there an agritourism element to it?
Oh yeah. Like I was just thinking about that this morning. Oh yeah, we got to bring this up, because when we would go to the farmers markets, we would sell bags of coffee and cups of coffee. And the cups of coffee were always a winner because we're getting our product closer to the consumer at that point, right? You make more money per pound of coffee if you sell it as a cup versus selling it as a pound versus selling it as green beans to a roaster, et cetera. So I think you can appreciate that the further down the supply chain or the consumer chain that the farmer can get their product, the better the edge is in terms of return on investment, right? So when we decided to stop doing the farmers markets, it was like, well, what are we going to do with this coffee? At that time, that's about when two really severe diseases showed up that impact coffee. One of them has not turned out to be anywhere near as bad as we had thought, but the other one, this little tiny beetle that bores into the coffee and is native to Africa and somehow got over to the state of Hawaii and is now here, and there's no getting rid of it. So now it's a management thing. That made a really huge difference in our annual yields. So we wouldn't have been in a position to sell coffee at markets anyways. So enter the ag tourism thing. Some people approached us and they said, hey, we'd love to do like a cacao, coffee, and chocolate tour. And we're like, okay. And they said, we'll do all the booking, all the insurance, we'll run the tours. You guys basically get like a site fee, a venue fee. We're like, okay, we can work with that. Because a lot of times when people talk about ag tourism, if it takes time out of the day for the farmer to do what the farmer's supposed to be doing, to give tours or tastings or something like that, it really cuts down on the ability of your farm to generate product, to generate food. So by kind of offloading that to that responsibility to a third party and then just getting a cut of the action that's mutually agreed upon, it works great for us. And so this gal that runs the Maui chocolate and coffee tours, she does all the booking. With COVID, when it used to be kind of open booking, and then with COVID, she was shut down for like 7 months, and then maybe even more, and then just did private bookings in little pods that people were all tested negative, et cetera. And then she was like, private bookings, this is the best, so there's no wild cards in terms of mixing different families together that don't get along during the tour. So she really has enjoyed that. And then as a result of that, we're bringing the tourists to our coffee rather than the other way around. So the tourists are tasting coffee, they're seeing where it's grown, they're seeing kind of the semi-mess that is our farm. And they also go, this is great. And then they buy coffee from us and, take that back home to the mainland or wherever they are. So that element of ag tourism has supplemented our income, plus it's given us a great outlet for added value products.
I guess I hadn't really conceived of how much COVID would have affected the situation over in Hawaii just because of tourism. Like, it hadn't really occurred to me how much that would have changed.
Oh, it's huge. We went from, so the population of our island is about 150,000, and on any given week during pre-COVID time, there'd be 85 to 90,000 tourists, sometimes up to 100,000. When COVID came and kind of the orders to shut down were spreading throughout the mainland and here, there was, in the space of 4 or 5 days, there were 18,000 rental cars parked at the airport that were formerly on our roads as tourism went down to a fraction of a percent.
Wow.
So it's bittersweet because the economy runs on tourism. But on the other hand, a lot of people that lived here were like, oh my gosh, this is what our island used to be like when there was a fraction of tourists over here. The beaches were empty. We were, instead of feeding tourists, we're feeding other families that live here. Although most of our business, I'd say 95% of our business, is strictly for people that live here. The restaurants serve people that live here. We don't sell much to the resort restaurants. So it didn't really have that big of an effect on us. But I think it made a lot of the people that live on this island, A, appreciate that there's people growing food here and you can buy high quality local produce. And then B, that, wow, maybe we have too many people on the island. We've exceeded the carrying capacity.
Yeah. Definitely COVID has revealed so many things to us. And I feel like that's a really interesting one.
Right.
Okay. So I want to get into some production stuff, and I want to talk about growing tomatoes, because I know this is something that's difficult that you've been able to do. Can you talk a little bit about what's the difficulties with growing things like tomatoes and maybe other crops? You mentioned peppers to me before. What is the difficulty there, and how are you managing that?
Those are fabulous questions. So if we start with tomatoes, the island of Maui used to produce over 1 million pounds of tomatoes a year back in the mid to late 70s. And spotted wilt mosaic made it in, and then sooner or later, a whole lot of other diseases started to come in on imports. And so it became very difficult to grow tomatoes here and to get them to actually end up being what you thought they were going to be and sell them. And it became very difficult to compete with mainland prices. And so a lot of the tomato growers just said, forget it, it's way too hard. And being kind of naive, we said, wow, and we'd see all these pictures on Instagram, we can grow tomatoes, come on. So we started off trying tons of different kinds of tomatoes. And we learned a lot about different kinds of tomato diseases, spotted wilt mosaic, late blight, early blight, all these different things. And so that started to train us to look for cultivars that might have resistance to that. And something we can talk about a little bit later that's endemic to tropical agriculture is root knot nematodes. So tomatoes get destroyed by them. So that weakens the plant significantly. So they might have disease resistance in the seed catalog, but when you add on root knot nematode pressure, then they crumble. So we'd spent a long time trying to grow all sorts of different tomatoes. And even when we got good tomatoes, the fruit flies would get them, the birds would get them. We had some success with some of the stuff that was coming out of North Carolina State Mountain Merit series because it had good late blight resistance, but that would get destroyed by the birds. And I think after 15 years, we've found a variety of cherry tomato called Valentine that is beyond our wildest dreams. It's, we prune it to a single stem. We do it on trellises, and we're getting about 120 pounds of cherry tomatoes a week. Beautiful cherry tomatoes. They don't crack. The fruit flies don't get them. The birds get some of them, but not enough to make a dent. And so that's been really positive. Friends of ours at higher elevation, they do their tomatoes in high tunnels, and the top half of the high tunnel is covered with plastic film, and that allows it to shed rain because they're in a really rainy setting. and the sides are covered with like window screen. So that allows some ventilation. And they also have electricity, so they can do some fans and things like that. And they've had really good success with heirloom tomatoes. They can only do them in the summer when it's a little warmer. This is at an elevation of about 3,400 feet. But tomatoes are a challenge. The big ones we've not been very successful with, but the little ones we're doing great.
You mentioned the 120 pounds per week on a Valentine. Do you know how many plants that is?
Yes, that's 200 plants.
Okay.
It's 4 trellises. We trellis them all on these 4-foot by 16-foot cattle panels that are raised up off of the ground, and they're on T-posts, so it's all reusable, and it works great. But I guess some of the things I'd scribbled down about the challenges of tropical farming were things about like maintaining, looking for the proper day length because we don't have a lot of light down here. So it's not like the mainland where you get longer day length during the growing season. We have a pretty short day length year round. So you have to have plants that are adapted to that. So take, for example, lettuce. You can get a packet of lettuce seeds and it says, it'll be ready for harvest in 52 days or 54 days. Well, you have to add on about 20% to that because we just don't have that much sunlight. So things that you can grow in Oregon are going to take longer and probably be a bit smaller down here because of the shorter day length.
But you're somewhat higher elevation too. Do you also have to consider sun intensity?
Oh, I guess we could. We haven't, but I guess we could. We just know that for us to grow a head of lettuce, it takes 72 days in the summertime, and that's from seeding. We do everything goes into 72 cells, and it's all transplants. So 70 plus days until it's ready, and then maybe about 80 days in the winter when the day length is less than 12 hours.
Wow. That one's kind of stunning because I guess I didn't realize the degree to which your day length was so different from ours.
Oh yeah, for onions, people. I teach a lot of classes through the college and through the Hawaii Farmers Union on sustainable agriculture, and we talk about all these different things. And I said when we come to plants, we get to onions, and I said you wouldn't think that something as apparently simple on the outside like an onion would be so responsive to day length. But it is. So if you get like a Walla Walla sweet, try to grow that here, it's not going to bulb up because we simply don't have the day length triggers for it. So you have to find things like Texas Granick, sometimes the Georgia Vidalias will work down here. And then some of the big seed companies like Bijou Seed actually breed tropical onions that are adapted to short day length. And we can grow some of those. It's really hard for us to get the seed because you have to buy like 5 pounds at a time. And it's like, that's more or less like 5 farmer lifetimes of seed for us.
5 pounds of onion seed is a lot of seed.
Yeah. So we have found some that will grow really well. Even as you go into short day length now, they're adapted to more their own schedule rather than being responsive to the day length.
And then the temperature's not changing a great deal, but is there a big difference in temperature between summer and winter?
Yes, there is. And that's another really interesting aspect of tropical agriculture. So in the summertime, our temperatures generally are in the high 80s and they might get into the low 70s at night. And so some lettuce varieties, some of the cultivars we use are like, we're not going there. They don't like it. So you just have to kind of hunt and peck and find the ones that do really well for summer production here. And then in the winter, we can use some of the cultivars that you might be more familiar with in the mainland. I guess gypsy broccoli does real well here in the winter. It hates the summertime, so we do imperial for a summer broccoli. And in the winter, I think our lowest temperature here has been 49, and more typically it's in like the mid 50s first thing in the morning, and then it'll get to the low 70s. So there is a change in temperature. What there isn't a change in is soil temperature. Our soil temperatures never go below 59. So that has some really interesting implications in terms of organic matter. So our microbes never go to sleep. They're always eating. So trying to keep organic matter high in the soil is a real challenge. So we have to do a lot of stuff with mulch and compost and cover crops to try to keep that soil organic matter up there. And that's one of the really big challenges we have because we have these clay-rich soils, and one of the ways to combat the stickiness and the physical properties of these clay-rich soils is by increasing the organic matter in the soil, so it tends to separate the clay particles. And we're able to do that. So parts of the farm, you can go after it with a broad fork, and it's kind of like heaven. Other parts of the farm, the soil we just haven't gotten it there yet, so it requires a little bit of cultivation. But we had moved from using a John Deere. My father-in-law used to use a rototiller for everything, and we had taken a class, like a 10-day class from Elaine Ingham back in 2004, and that was like the last time we used a rototiller. We were like, this is really damaging. So then we were using a disc harrow, and sometimes that would work, sometimes not, but that would fit on the back of the 46 horsepower John Deere. And then after becoming aware of the market gardener approaches, we're like, you know what? We wanted to expand the farm, but the cost of land here is ridiculous. So we said maybe we should improve the efficiency of the footprint that we have. And so by moving to 100-foot by 2.5-foot beds and managing it with a BCS piece of equipment and a broad fork, we're able to increase our growing area by 20% without adding any more real estate. And so that's kind of where we are now, is using a broad fork for parts of the farm, and then using the BCS. Mostly we use the BCS to the rotary plow to push stuff from the pathways back onto the middle of the bed. And then we might use the power harrow to smooth it out and incorporate amendments, or we might just use one of the big bed preparation rakes that works just fine as well.
Yeah, not a lot of difference between those two tools, except for one is more efficient and maybe a little heavier. Just a rake and a power harrow. I think the power harrow has a lot of great utility when it comes to doing, incorporating some amendments really quickly.
Sure, but if our soil is so rich in clay that just a little bit of weight causes compaction, and that becomes a real problem. So we really try to stay away from using anything that's got some weight in it. So now we're using more broad fork and things like that. And the amendments that we use are, we use like 30 gallons of our compost, even though we should be putting in like 100 gallons, but we just don't have that much. And we use, we're all about trying to intercept waste at whatever level we can to generate fertility. So we get the coffee chaff from a commercial roaster. So this is like the silver skin on a peanut. It's something that's pulled out of roasters because it tends to cause spontaneous combustion and roaster fires. So they have little exhaust things that pull all the coffee chaff off, and they stash it in bins. And I said, well, what do you guys do with that stuff? And they said, well, we throw it away. I said, I'll take it. So for 6 years, we've been getting probably 50, 60 pounds of coffee chaff a week. And we just add that back into our soil. It's got a neutral carbon nitrogen ratio, 20-1. So it's not a giver, it's not a taker. It just adds some more organic matter to the soil. And then we'll add mineral amendments depending upon our soil analyses, and we'll add feather meal as a source of, it's basically the only off-island source of nitrogen that we use. And so that'll be how we'll prepare our beds for planting.
Not to jump back, but we talked a little bit when we were talking about tomatoes and that sort of stuff. Did you talk a little bit about your tunnels that you use for exclusion, what you're actually wrapping those in?
Oh, right. Yeah. I think you and I talked about it before we went quote unquote live.
Right.
We found that there's some insects here that are unmanageable with organic sprays. Pepper weevil is one. It's a small weevil that lays eggs in the pepper flower, and then the pepper fruit grows around the eggs. The eggs hatch, and then there's larvae inside the pepper. The plant responds by dropping those peppers, but if they don't drop them and you pick them and you're unaware of what's going on, then you're selling wormy peppers, which is never a good thing. Similarly, the tomatoes get fruit flies, cucumbers, and any of the cucurbits get melon fly. So we can use traps to control some of the things like melon fly and fruit fly, but they're limited effectiveness. And the pepper weevil, there's nothing that we can really use except for exclusion. So we were able to get a couple of NRCS grants. One is they were both seasonal high tunnel grants. And we got a large high tunnel that's 34 feet by 97 feet, 12 feet at the apex. It's a kind of a big Quonset hut type of thing. And then we covered it with a 20 mesh insect screen. So NRCS was actually pretty good. They worked with us because I said, I don't want to put plastic on this thing because it'll bake everything inside. But I want to put this insect screen on. They said, well, that's not one of our standards. Well, maybe you can make it one of your standards. And so they were really good about it. And they said, okay, you're good to go. So I got this structure. We put it up. It has done exceptional to crappy over the years. You just have to find the right screen for it so that it breathes well, because if the temperatures get too high in there, pollination of tomatoes drops dramatically. But it does keep the insects of interest out. And we just put up a Johnny's low tunnel, and that's performed really, really well. We like that. So we're able to grow cucumbers, tomatoes, peppers without getting any of the insect pressure. We do have to manage disease issues because the humidity is a bit higher and the temperature is a bit higher. So problems like downy mildew, powdery mildew become challenging. And let's see, in the wintertime, sometimes when we get high pressure from the imported cabbage moth, we rotate our brassica crops into these tunnels, and it keeps those critters out as well. So that works really well for us. And that's part of one of the things that you have to do in tropical agriculture is manage root knot nematode. And I think it's the same problem in parts of the southern U.S. where they have root knot nematode.
Yeah.
And so it turns out that a lot of mainland crops, carrots, chard, beets, etc., are very susceptible to root knot nematodes. So we noticed right away that they were having a really negative effect on some of these plants. So we had to come up with a scheme of crop rotation that's different than what you would use in the mainland. So if you take a market gardener approach in terms of, well, you can do your beans and then you can put your tomatoes in and stuff like that. You can't do that here. You put your beans in, the beans attract root knot nematode. You put tomatoes in after the beans, you're not even getting out of the water. The root knot nematode will destroy things. So we're pretty religious with our rotation scheme. So one of the things we do in the tunnels, which is what we do with all of our beds as well, is that we just took out some tomatoes and we put in cauliflower. So cauliflower and brassicas are a non-host for root knot nematodes. So we can go back when the cauliflower comes out this winter, we can put in cucumbers because they do get root knot nematode. But you have to rotate between those two things, host and non-host. And in some cases, we'll use cover crops like sun hemp, Piper Sudan grass that are actually nematocidal. And that really puts a big dent in the root knot nematode. So by applying this for 10 plus years now, we can now get really beautiful carrots, really beautiful beets, et cetera, et cetera. And it's just, we have to keep that management tool on the go all the time. And that's one of the big differences of trying to use a rotation scheme that's mainland based versus adapting something that's based more for the tropics where the root knot guys are going to be a pain.
With the insect netting, what did you end up landing on? Like, what was the net that actually works?
The one that works the best is 20 mesh. So I think that's 20 threads per inch or something like that. I'm not sure exactly how they do it. That keeps out the weevils, keeps out the melon fly, birds, obviously, it keeps out any of the butterflies and things like that. It will not keep out mites, and it will not keep out, obviously, microbial diseases, and occasionally aphids get in there. But now you only have to deal with 2 or 3 things instead of having to deal with 6 or 7. So the 20 mesh works really well. 17, if you can find it, is even better. The smaller the mesh size, the bigger the holes are in the mesh. We experimented one year with 40 mesh because that's all we could get, and that was a disaster. That was way too hot and way too humid, and it really didn't do much benefit for us.
Was there anything else that you were thinking that would be worth mentioning or that you wanted to mention?
Oh, I was going to say something a little geeky about clays, right? Because I don't know how much people are interested in clays. I know southern growers have to deal with clay a lot. There's clay and there's clay. So there's clay as a particle size, it's less than 2 microns. And then there's clay as a mineral. And there's a whole family of minerals called clay minerals. So you can have clay that is what's called charge neutral. It has no benefit whatsoever except for its fine particle size, and it has a slight negative charge. Because you want stuff that's negatively charged in your soil. Could be organic matter, could be certain clays, because it increases your cation exchange capacity, right? It holds on to the calcium and the nitrate and magnesium, all these positively charged things. And there's also clays that are highly charged. So, for example, if you're in a part of the world where you have clays that are called smectites or montmorillonites, they're positively charged and they're a real benefit to nutrient retention. If you're in a place like ours, where our clays are charge neutral, they have no charge, they're a pain in the neck to deal with because your soil texture is so dependent upon their physical response to water. If they get too dry, they're like cement. If they're too wet, they're like goo. So there's this happy zone where you hope you find it before you sink in your broad fork or try to make a bed preparation where the water content is just right so you get some reasonable, modest tillage.
Yeah, it's important to understand that. Are you adding clays then or no? For your
No, we're mostly adding organic matter. One of the things that we do add each year, we do ginger in 15-gallon bags using coconut peat or coconut coir as the medium, along with a fertilizer, an organic fertilizer. And the reason we do that is because bacterial wilt of ginger is real prominent throughout Hawaii. We used to grow over 1,500 acres of ginger in the state per year, and now it's somewhere around 140, something like that. And it's mostly because ginger wilt has come in and wiped out a lot of the ginger growers. So we grow them in a sterile medium. And probably a lot of your listeners would know that they get their ginger seed from Biker Dude on the Big Island, which is where we got ours. And then we can save ours and use it again and again. And so we grow in these coconut coir. And then at the end of the ginger season, after we harvest that, that's an organic amendment that goes back into each of our beds just to increase the organic matter in the soil and to try to break apart some of these clays to provide a little bit more granularity to the soil. I mean, the microbes do a lot. If we had no microbial life in the soil, which we didn't when we first got here, it was basically just bacteria from all the years of conventional agriculture. It broke up into huge concrete blocks anytime you use like a subsoiler, like a ripper or something like that. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's terrible. But now, as we get more and more life into the soil, it's starting to create a lot more of a sand type texture. So it's increased our water retention and our airspace in the soil. So, when we started regenerating this farm, there were no worms, there was no fungus. And now the soil, like anytime we turn it with a broad fork, there's a lot of worms. And we get, sprouts of fungus coming in between carrots and chard and stuff like that. So we've really improved the diversity of microbe life. And the byproduct of that is taking the texture from predominantly clay to one that's more granular and has more of a sand texture. So there's better penetration of water and air into the soil.
Yeah. So can I ask you one last geeky question? It's about ginger.
Okay.
What's the curing process for ginger? Like, I've read a few things and I've found a few videos, but nothing seems like very definitive of how to cure it to the point that it's actually good, usable seed for the next year.
Okay. I think in the mainland, you have a bit of a problem. So typically, as I understand it from looking at Instagram farms, they're starting to harvest their ginger now, and maybe they've grown it in high tunnels, et cetera, et cetera. So the ginger that they're harvesting now is what we would call here young ginger. It's the rhizomes are pretty large. They've got a high moisture content. They're not quite as pungent as the classic, more cured ginger, and it will not resprout. So what we do is we're going to start harvesting our ginger next week and selling some of it as fresh ginger. But we have a percentage of our ginger that we will allow the top to die off completely. And there's some sort of change that happens to the ginger for us between November and say February. When the tops die off, something happens within the rhizome. And if you then harvest the rhizomes in February, dry them down just a little bit, then those are replantable. But because most of the mainland farms are harvesting young ginger, you're not going to be able to replant that. So there's a reason why Biker Dude ginger becomes available to everybody in late February, early March. That's when the ginger has made the transition from this relatively soft rhizome in November to something that's a bit more dense, more fibrous, more pungent, and plantable.
Right. So effectively, you need a longer season than most of us have here in the mainland, except for maybe further south. And I'm assuming that die-off is not, I mean, well, you didn't mention any frost, right? So you don't have frost. So that die-off of the leaves is actually just a natural occurrence. It dies off later in the year when the sun, presumably, it starts to get colder and the sun presumably is not as high.
Right. I'm not sure what triggers it, but it's usually like 9-10 months in. That's what it does every year. So we'll plant in March, and then it's usually late February, the tops start dying off.
Yeah. Okay. That's great. I've always wondered because I can never get a definitive, clear answer on that when I'm looking around online. So thank you for that. And also, Gerry, thank you so much for your time. This has been a great conversation. I've really enjoyed hearing about this version of tropical farming that was not what I envisioned. Right.
Well, it wasn't what we envisioned when we got here either. You could imagine coming from zone 1A to zone 11 or 12 is a little bit of a change.
Yeah, absolutely. I can only imagine. I bet your backyard garden, when you were talking about that earlier, like translating some of your backyard gardening to Hawaii was definitely a challenge.
Oh yeah, no question about that. Right. And we're still evolving because of, the age that we're at. We've been doing this for almost 20 years, and we're in our late 60s. And so, what does, at least for us, so many of the farms that I see online, people are in their 30s or their 40s or their 20s or something like that. And occasionally there's, some older folks out there, but they do have younger farm managers, and we don't have that. So we're trying to envision what does our farm look like as we move into our so-called golden years. So we're, stopping the CSA and in part decreasing some of the diversity that we have on the farm will potentially decrease our workload, but still not generate the same amount of income, but generate some income just to keep Uncle Sam happy with some of the stuff and some of the criteria for our local government in terms of what constitutes ag production, et cetera. So we're trying to find our way in terms of what an older farm looks like in terms of the crops, the time commitment, where can you spend a little time doing something else besides farming.
And do you have employees, and are you bringing on employees for that?
We do not have employees. We've had an amazing run of interns. I think I counted it up the other day. There was lots of our current interns said, well, how many have you had? And I think over the course of the 18 years, we've had something like 75 different interns.
Wow.
Some of them have become farmers themselves, like Little Big Farm in Olympia. They were interns here. Some of them are not into farming at all, but they've got their own compost piles now, and they understand what goes into producing food, so they're cognizant that way, and they're way more appreciative because some of them have bailed out after a month. They said, this is way too hard work, and it's like, well, this is what it takes, So the next time you go buy food at a grocery store, think about who's doing it and the hard work and what their family might look like, et cetera, et cetera. So we've run it pretty much without employees.
Well, Gerry, thank you again. This has been such a pleasure.
All right, Jesse.
All right. If you enjoyed that episode, make sure to follow Kupa'a Farms on Instagram and all the places. As always, we will hook it up with links in the show notes. Now that the podcast is over and you're going to be wiping your hands off of dirt and scrolling to find something else to listen to, consider listening to the Winter Growers podcast with Clara Coleman. She just launched season 2 and it's amazing. Oh, and you could also pick up a copy of my book. That's a great idea as well. Go to no-tillgrowers.com for all the deets on that and other opportunities to support our work. And remember, hats are up at the Patreon page today, and they will be available to the public through no-tillgrowers.com next week. So that's patreon.com/no-tillgrowers if you want to make sure and get one, or by the end of the week, no-tillgrowers.com. This episode was partially supported by a grant through Southern SARE. Make sure you are subscribed to this podcast wherever you are getting it and leave a review. But this week, all reviews must discuss how we should all one day meet in Hawaii for the coffee bean harvest because it's cold and rainy here, and I could use that motivation and a fresh cup of coffee. Huge thanks to No Till Growers co-founder Jackson Roulette for all his help. Thanks to Josh Satin. Thanks to Willie Breeding for the theme music. Thanks to Hannah Crabtree for being an amazing partner and mama and frankly superhero. Thank you all for listening. We'll see you next week. Bye.